In the late summer of 1944, somewhere along the hedgerows of Normandy, a German Panther tank commander peered through his optics, scanning the bocage for threats. His crew had been briefed on Allied armor. "Watch for the Shermans," they said. The American M10 tank destroyers with their distinctive open turrets were annoying but manageable. Their 3-inch guns struggled against the Panther's frontal armor, especially at range. The German crews had learned to respect distance, to use their superior optics and firepower to engage, before the lighter American vehicles could get close enough to threaten them. But on this day, something was different. The M10 that emerged from behind a stone farmhouse looked exactly like the ones they'd encountered before. Same silhouette, same open-topped turret, same olive-drab paint. What the Panther commander didn't know, what German intelligence hadn't fully grasped yet, was that this particular M10 was hiding a secret that would prove lethal in the next 60 seconds. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're enjoying this content about real World War II history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more detailed historical narratives like this one. And don't forget to leave a comment letting us know what aspect of World War II you'd like us to cover next. The story of the M10 Achilles, as this modified tank destroyer would eventually be known, begins not in Britain or America, but in the dusty campaigns of North Africa and the bitter fighting in Tunisia. When American tank destroyers first rolled into combat in 1942, they represented a bold doctrinal experiment. The United States Army had developed an entirely new branch, the Tank Destroyer Force, specifically to counter the German blitzkrieg tactics that had devastated Poland and France. The concept was revolutionary for its time. Rather than spreading anti-tank guns thinly across the front in a static defensive line, tank destroyer battalions would be held in reserve at the corps or army level. When German armor punched through, these fast, hard-hitting tank destroyers would rush to the breakthrough point and destroy the armored spearhead. Speed and firepower were prioritized over heavy armor. The M10, officially designated the 3-inch gun motor carriage M10, embodied this philosophy perfectly. Built on a modified M4 Sherman chassis, it featured sloped armor that was thinner than a standard tank but provided better protection through its angles. The open-topped turret allowed excellent visibility for the crew and reduced weight, enabling faster speeds. Its main armament was a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun that had been adapted for the anti-tank role, capable of firing both armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. When M10s first saw action in Tunisia, crews were pleased with the vehicle's mobility and reliability. The M10 could keep pace with armored advances, and its gun was adequate against the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that made up the bulk of German armored forces at that time. But by 1943, the tactical situation was evolving rapidly and not in favor of the Allies. German tank design had taken a quantum leap forward with the introduction of two formidable new machines, the Tiger I heavy tank and the Panther medium tank. The Tiger I, weighing 44 tons and armed with the fearsome 88mm gun, had armor up to 100 millimeters thick on its front. The Panther, arguably an even more dangerous opponent, combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with excellent frontal armor protection and good mobility. These weren't just incremental improvements. They represented a fundamental shift in armored warfare. American tank crews and tank destroyer crews were discovering, sometimes fatally, that their weapons were inadequate. The M10's 3-inch gun could penetrate a Tiger I's side armor at reasonable combat ranges, but the frontal armor was largely immune, except at dangerously close distances. Against the Panther's sloped frontal plate, the situation was even worse. The British faced the same problem, but they had a solution already in development. British ordnance engineers had created one of the war's most effective anti-tank weapons, the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder gun. Despite its name suggesting a weight measurement, The 17-pounder designation actually referred to the weight of the shell it fired, translating to a caliber of 76.2 millimeters, or 3 inches. But the 17-pounder was far more powerful than the American 3-inch gun that shared the same caliber. The 17-pounder's longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity gave it dramatically superior armor penetration. With standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap rounds, the 17-pounder could penetrate approximately 163 millimeters of homogeneous steel armor at 500 meters. This gave it the capability to defeat a Tiger I from well over 3 kilometers away. Even the Panther's formidable frontal armor wasn't safe. The 17-pounder firing armor-piercing, discarding sabot rounds, which began reaching front-line units in August 1944, could penetrate the Panther's glacis plate from 1,500 meters. The British had already begun mounting the 17-pounder in Sherman tanks, creating the Sherman Firefly, a conversion that gave British armored regiments a fighting chance against German heavy armor. But the British Army's Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments needed a self-propelled platform for the 17-pounder as well. The Americans were supplying Britain with M10 tank destroyers under Lend-Lease, and British engineers realized the M10's turret design made it an ideal candidate for mounting the 17-pounder. The M10's turret was counterbalanced, designed to allow for different gun weights without extensive modification. This feature, originally intended to provide flexibility for American gun development, would now allow the British to install a weapon far more powerful than the Americans had envisioned. The conversion program began in early 1944. British ordnance workshops removed the 3-inch gun from M10s and installed the 17-pounder in its place. The heavier, longer 17-pounder required modifications to maintain the vehicle's balance. A distinctive muzzle brake was fitted to the end of the barrel to reduce recoil forces. The turret needed an enlarged counterweight at the rear to balance the additional weight and length of the gun protruding from the front. These modifications were immediately visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The muzzle brake and extended barrel with the bulky counterweight behind the turret made the 17-pounder armed M10 visually distinct from its American counterpart. British planners had initially hoped to have 1,000 M10s converted to 17-pounder armament in time for the D-Day landings. However, the conversion program didn't begin until April 1944, leaving insufficient time to meet this ambitious goal. By June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, only 124 M10s had been converted to what the British officially designated as the 17-pounder self-propelled Achilles. This meant that many British anti-tank units went ashore with standard American M10s, armed with the 3-inch gun, facing German armor with an inadequate weapon. But the conversion program accelerated dramatically after D-Day, as the urgent need for better anti-tank weapons became brutally apparent in the Bocage country. By the end of 1944, 816 M10s had been converted to Achilles standard, with 152 conversions completed in November alone. Eventually, 1,100 of the 1,650 M10s supplied to Britain would receive the 17-pounder, making the Achilles the second most numerous Allied armored vehicle to carry this formidable gun, behind only the Sherman Firefly. The Achilles served in Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments throughout the Northwest European campaign and in Italy. These regiments were structured differently from American tank destroyer battalions, reflecting different tactical doctrines. While American tank destroyers were theoretically held in reserve to counter armored breakthroughs, British anti-tank regiments were more flexibly employed, often working in close support of armored and infantry divisions. The Achilles crews quickly discovered they had one of the most powerful anti-tank weapons on the battlefield. The 17-pounder could engage any German tank with confidence at combat ranges that would have been suicidal for a standard M10. A Tiger I, the heavily armored beast that American crews feared, could be destroyed from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. Panthers, which had proven nearly invulnerable to most Allied tank guns from the front, could now be penetrated frontally when the rare armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition was available. But this power came with a significant problem, one that had already been identified with the Sherman Firefly. German tank crews and anti-tank gunners weren't blind. The long barrel of the 17-pounder, extending well beyond the length of a standard tank gun, was immediately distinctive. The muzzle brake at the end of the barrel was particularly conspicuous, clearly marking the vehicle as something different, something more dangerous. German units began identifying Fireflies in June 1944, shortly after the Normandy landings. While post-war claims that Germans were specifically ordered to target Fireflies first have been debated by historians, there's no question that German crews recognized these long-barreled Shermans as priority threats. The same recognition would apply to the Achilles once German forces encountered them in numbers. Achilles crews, like their Firefly counterparts, adopted various camouflage techniques to disguise their vehicles. Some crews painted the muzzle brake to make it less conspicuous, using colors that would blend with backgrounds or break up its outline. The distinctive counterweight behind the turret was sometimes painted in camouflage patterns or even false markings to disguise its purpose. Some crews went further, attempting to paint false shadows on the barrel to make the long gun appear shorter from a distance. These weren't official modifications sanctioned by high command. They were field expedients, survival tactics developed by men who knew that being identified as a high-value target reduced your life expectancy. The irony was profound. The Achilles crews had been given one of the best anti-tank weapons in the European theater, a gun that could confidently engage any German tank, but they had to hide that capability to avoid drawing concentrated fire. The tactical situation created by this disguise game added a psychological dimension to armored combat. German tank commanders, when they spotted what appeared to be a standard M10 in the distance, would make tactical decisions based on that identification. They might choose engagement ranges and tactics appropriate for fighting a vehicle with a 3-inch gun, ranges where they held the advantage. Then, when the M10 opened fire and its shell penetrated German armor from a distance that should have been safe, the shock and confusion would be complete. The German crew's last moments would be spent realizing they had fatally misidentified their opponent. One of the most significant actions involving M10s, though not specifically confirmed as Achilles variants, occurred during the Battle of Dompierre in September 1944. French and American forces, equipped with M10s and Sherman tanks, faced a German armored force, including Panthers. The M10s took up concealed positions and waited. When the Panthers advanced, the tank destroyers opened fire from well-chosen positions. Lieutenant Morris Allong's M10, designated Storm, knocked out a Panther with 3 shots from a kilometer away. Another M10, Mistral, added 2 more Panthers to the tally. The combination of good positioning, crew training, and adequate firepower proved devastating. The Germans lost numerous tanks in the engagement, demonstrating how effectively the M10 platform could be employed when used according to sound tactical principles. Earlier in July 1944, the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion had engaged the Panzerlehr Division near Le Désert in Normandy. In a fierce 2-day battle, much of it at ranges less than 200 meters, the American M10s destroyed 12 Panthers, 1 Panzerwaffe, and 1 Sturmgeschütz, the 3rd assault gun. This action illustrated both the capabilities and the limitations of the standard M10. At close range, where the crew's skill and the vehicle's good visibility came into play, the M10 could be effective even against Panthers. But these close-range engagements were terrifyingly dangerous for the lightly armored tank destroyers. An Achilles with its 17-pounder could have engaged those same targets at much greater ranges, providing a crucial margin of safety. The technical specifications of the Achilles help explain its effectiveness. The vehicle retained the M10's reliable powertrain and suspension, capable of a maximum road speed of 51 kilometers per hour, with an operational range of 300 kilometers. The crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Armor protection remained the same as the standard M10, with a maximum of 37 millimeters on the front hull, sloped for better effective thickness. The open-topped turret, while leaving the crew vulnerable to artillery and airbursts, provided excellent situational awareness. Secondary armament consisted of a Browning M2 heavy machine gun of 12.7 millimeter caliber for anti-aircraft defense, and some vehicles carried a Bren-Light machine gun of 7.7 millimeter caliber. The 17-pounder gun itself was a masterpiece of British ordnance engineering. Soviet testing of captured 17-pounders after the war praised the weapon's high penetrating power, fault-free operation of its recoil mechanisms and breech, good precision and stability. The main criticism was that the gun was heavy for its caliber, weighing 2,862 kilograms in its towed configuration. But in a self-propelled mounting like the Achilles, where the vehicle carried the weight, this was less of a concern. The ammunition types available to Achilles crews included the standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round, which was reasonably accurate and effective against all but the heaviest German armor. The high-explosive round was useful against soft targets and fortifications. And when available, the armor-piercing discarding sabot round provided phenomenal penetration over 200 millimeters at 1,000 meters, enough to defeat any German tank frontally. However, the armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition had significant drawbacks that limited its use. The subcaliber penetrator, surrounded by a sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel, was extraordinarily effective when it hit. But accuracy was poor compared to standard armor-piercing rounds. British tests showed that at 400 yards, armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds had only a 50% hit probability against a Panther's turret, while standard armor-piercing rounds achieved 90%. At 500 yards, this dropped to 33% for armor-piercing discarding sabot versus 73% for standard armor-piercing. Additionally, armor-piercing discarding sabot was always in short supply, with chronic shortages throughout the campaign. Crews hoarded the few rounds they received, saving them for situations where only the superior penetration would suffice. The tactical employment of the Achilles reflected both British anti-tank doctrine and the practical realities of the Northwest European campaign. Unlike American tank destroyer doctrine, which envisioned rapid movement to counter armored breakthroughs, British anti-tank regiments often found themselves in more static defensive positions or providing overwatch for advancing armored formations. The Achilles' ability to engage German armor at extended range made it ideal for these roles. Positioned in hull-down locations with good fields of fire, an Achilles could dominate key terrain and provide a secure flank for friendly operations. The open-topped turret, while a vulnerability, allowed the commander excellent visibility to spot threats and coordinate with supporting units. One aspect of the Achilles that deserves recognition is the quality of British gun crews. Royal Artillery had a long tradition of precision gunnery, and this training showed in combat. Soviet evaluations of the 17-pounder specifically noted its good precision and stability, qualities that could only be fully exploited by well-trained crews. British tank destroyer crews underwent rigorous training in range estimation, ballistics, and crew coordination. The loader's job was particularly demanding with the 17-pounder, as the large, heavy ammunition required considerable physical strength and endurance to maintain a high rate of fire. The gunner needed to master the weapon's ballistics at various ranges and with different ammunition types, each having distinct flight characteristics. The commander had to make rapid tactical decisions: which target to engage first, which ammunition type to use, when to displace to a new position. As the campaign in Northwest Europe progressed through late 1944 and into 1945, the Achilles proved its worth repeatedly. The vehicle participated in the advance through France, the fighting along the German border, the winter battles, and finally the drive into Germany itself. In Italy, where British forces continued their grinding advance up the peninsula, Achilles tank destroyers provided crucial anti-tank capability against German defensive positions. The Italian terrain, with its mountains and narrow valleys, often forced engagements at shorter ranges where the 17-pounder's power was devastating. German tank crews and anti-tank gunners gradually learned to identify the Achilles by its distinctive silhouette, just as they had learned to recognize the Firefly. But knowing an enemy vehicle is dangerous and being able to effectively counter it are two different things. The psychological impact of the 17-pounder should not be underestimated. German tank crews who had grown accustomed to their armor advantage, who had learned that most Allied tanks and tank destroyers couldn't penetrate their frontal armor at combat ranges, suddenly faced a weapon that negated that advantage. A Tiger commander who had confidently engaged Shermans and standard M10s at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, knowing his frontal armor was essentially immune, now had to consider that any long-barreled Allied vehicle might be carrying a 17-pounder capable of destroying his tank from 2 kilometers away. This uncertainty affected tactical decision-making. German armor became more cautious, less willing to expose themselves, more dependent on ambush tactics rather than the aggressive maneuver warfare that had characterized early blitzkrieg operations. If you're finding this deep dive into World War II armor fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on. We regularly post detailed historical content like this, and your support through likes and comments helps us continue producing these videos. The production numbers tell an interesting story about Allied priorities and logistics. Of the approximately 1,650 M10s delivered to Britain, 1,100 were eventually converted to Achilles standard. This represents a massive commitment of workshop time and resources during a period of intense combat operations. The fact that conversions accelerated dramatically after D-Day, with over 800 conversions completed in the second half of 1944, demonstrates how urgent the need was for effective anti-tank weapons. British commanders had seen their forces struggle against German heavy armor in Normandy's Bocage country, where the close terrain often forced engagements at ranges where German armor superiority was decisive. The Achilles helped level that playing field. Comparisons between the Achilles and other Allied tank destroyers highlight its strengths and weaknesses. The American M10, with its 3-inch gun, was more than adequate against most German armor when the vehicle was first deployed, but struggled against Tigers and Panthers. The M36 tank destroyer, which began reaching American units in late 1944, mounted a 90mm gun that provided better performance than the 3-inch, but still didn't match the 17-pounder's penetration. The M18 Hellcat, fastest of the American tank destroyers, sacrificed armor for speed and mounted a 76mm gun similar to that used in late-model Shermans. On paper, the 17-pounder in the Achilles provided superior armor penetration to any of these American weapons when using standard ammunition, and dramatically superior penetration with armor-piercing, discarding sabot rounds. However, the Achilles wasn't without limitations. The open-top turret remained a significant vulnerability. Artillery airbursts, mortar fire, and even machine gun fire from elevated positions could inflict casualties on the exposed crew. The armor protection, while adequate against small arms and shell fragments, couldn't withstand hits from German tank guns or anti-tank weapons. This meant the Achilles relied on concealment, positioning, and the ability to engage first from longer ranges. Crew training and tactical doctrine emphasized using terrain to maximum advantage, engaging from hull-down positions where only the turret was exposed, and displacing after firing to avoid counter-battery fire. These were the same tactics that made towed anti-tank guns effective, now applied to a mobile, self-propelled platform. The maintenance and logistics of operating the Achilles in combat conditions presented their own challenges. The vehicle combined American mechanical components with a British gun, creating potential supply complications. Fortunately, the M10 chassis was mechanically reliable, sharing many components with the ubiquitous Sherman tank, so spare parts for the automotive components were generally available. The 17-pounder gun was well-proven and reliable, with Soviet testing specifically praising its fault-free operation. Ammunition supply was more problematic, particularly for the highly desired armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds. British logistics had to supply 17-pounder ammunition to both Achilles tank destroyers and Firefly tanks, as well as to towed 17-pounder anti-tank guns, creating significant demand. The standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap ammunition was more readily available and adequate for most targets, but crews always wanted more of the premium ammunition. One often overlooked aspect of the Achilles story is the crew experience. These were men, mostly British and Commonwealth soldiers, who operated their vehicles in combat conditions day after day. The open-topped turret meant exposure to the elements in all weather. The cold, rain, and mud of Northwest Europe made life miserable for crews. Inside the vehicle, conditions were cramped, with 5 men and their equipment, ammunition, and supplies crammed into a space that wasn't designed for comfort. The noise of the engine, the concussion when the 17-pounder fired, the acrid smell of propellant and hot metal, these were constant companions. Yet these crews maintained their vehicles, executed their missions, and engaged enemy armor that could destroy them with a single, well-placed shot. The camouflage and deception efforts by Achilles crews deserve further examination because they represent an interesting intersection of official doctrine and soldier initiative. The British Army's official camouflage instructions emphasized breaking up vehicle outlines and matching backgrounds. But the specific efforts to disguise the 17-pounder's distinctive features went beyond standard practice. Crews were improvising survival tactics based on their understanding that German gunners would prioritize dangerous targets. Some units shared techniques that had proven effective. The practice of painting false shadows to make the gun barrel appear shorter showed considerable tactical sophistication. At combat ranges, especially in the variable lighting conditions of dawn, dusk, or overcast weather, these visual deceptions could buy crucial seconds of confusion. Those seconds might mean the difference between getting off the first shot or being hit first. German recognition of the threat posed by 17-pounder armed vehicles evolved throughout the campaign. Early encounters in Normandy caught German crews by surprise. Intelligence reports began identifying these long-barreled Allied vehicles and warning units to be cautious. However, recent historical research has questioned whether Germans actually issued formal orders prioritizing Fireflies and, by extension, Achilles tank destroyers. What seems clear is that German tank commanders and anti-tank crews, as experienced combat veterans, recognized dangerous weapons and reacted accordingly. When you're in a tank and you see a gun barrel that's noticeably longer than standard Allied weapons, professional military instinct tells you that's a priority threat. Whether or not formal orders existed, the tactical logic of eliminating the most dangerous opponent first would naturally lead to targeting 17-pounder vehicles when they could be identified. The 17-pounder's effectiveness against German armor has been extensively documented in post-war analysis. British testing demonstrated that the weapon could penetrate a Tiger I's frontal armor at ranges where the Tiger's crew might not even realize they were under effective fire. Against the Tiger II or King Tiger, the most heavily armored German tank to see service, the 17-pounder with armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition could penetrate the turret front at 1,100 yards and could defeat the side armor at greater distances. The Panther, with its excellent frontal armor, remained a difficult target frontally for standard 17-pounder ammunition, but the armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds made frontal penetration possible at reasonable combat ranges. From the side or rear, the 17-pounder could destroy a Panther easily at any tactical range. The contrast with the American 3-inch gun that armed standard M10s is striking. The 3-inch gun was a capable weapon against medium armor, but it struggled against the heavy armor of Tigers and the sloped frontal plates of Panthers. American tank destroyer crews had to rely on flanking shots, ambush tactics at close range, or sheer weight of numbers to deal with German heavy armor. The introduction of the M36 with its 90mm gun improved the situation, but even this weapon didn't match the 17-pounder's performance. British crews operating Achilles tank destroyers had a psychological advantage. They knew their gun could reliably penetrate any German tank they might face. This confidence affected tactical decision-making and crew morale. As the war progressed into 1945 and Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Achilles continued to prove valuable. German armor was increasingly scarce, with fuel shortages and production difficulties limiting the number of tanks available for defensive operations. However, when German armor did appear, it was often the latest and most dangerous types: King Tigers, Jag Panthers, and other heavily armored vehicles. The 17-pounder remained one of the few Allied weapons that could reliably engage these targets. Additionally, the Achilles' high-explosive ammunition proved useful against fortified positions, pillboxes, and other strong points that characterized German defensive lines. The total Allied victory in May 1945 ended the Achilles' combat career in Europe, though some vehicles continued in British service post-war. The lessons learned from the Achilles program influenced post-war British armor development. The success of the 17-pounder demonstrated the value of high-velocity anti-tank guns and informed the development of subsequent British tank guns. The concept of mounting powerful guns on lighter, more mobile platforms continued to influence tank destroyer and anti-tank vehicle design. The armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition type, which had proven so effective despite its accuracy limitations, became the standard for post-war armor-piercing ammunition development. Looking back at the Achilles program from a historical perspective, several factors contributed to its success. First, the fortuitous compatibility between the American M10 chassis and the British 17-pounder gun allowed for rapid conversion without extensive redesign. Second, the urgent operational need for better anti-tank weapons drove the conversion program forward despite wartime resource constraints. Third, the quality of British Royal Artillery crews ensured that the weapon's potential was fully exploited in combat. Fourth, the tactical doctrine that emphasized positioning, concealment, and engagement at appropriate ranges played to the Achilles' strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities. The story of German tank crews not knowing that M10 might be hiding a 17-pounder upgrade speaks to larger themes in armored warfare. Intelligence and reconnaissance are crucial force multipliers in combat. The ability to correctly identify enemy capabilities determines tactical decisions that can mean the difference between victory and defeat. When German armor engaged what appeared to be a standard M10 at a range they considered safe, only to be destroyed by a 17-pounder they didn't know was there, it represented a catastrophic intelligence failure at the tactical level. The British and Commonwealth crews who operated Achilles tank destroyers exploited this confusion through camouflage and deception, gaining tactical advantages from their opponent's uncertainty. The visual similarity between the standard M10s and the Achilles, despite the distinctive muzzle brake and counterweight, could be explained by several factors. At combat ranges of several hundred to over 1,000 meters, especially in the varied terrain and vegetation of northwest Europe, positive identification of specific features was difficult. Dust, smoke, poor visibility, and the stress of combat all degraded a tank commander's ability to precisely identify enemy vehicles. Additionally, German crews encountering Allied tank destroyers would initially assume they were facing the standard, more common variant, unless they had clear evidence otherwise. This assumption, while reasonable, could prove fatal when an Achilles opened fire. The technical achievement represented by the Achilles conversion program should not be understated. British ordnance workshops managed to convert over 1,000 vehicles while the war was ongoing, often working close to the combat zone. The conversion required precision work to properly install the 17-pounder, adjust the counterweight, fit the muzzle brake, and ensure all components functioned correctly. Each converted vehicle then had to be tested and delivered to operational units. This logistical and technical effort was accomplished while Britain was also producing new tanks, maintaining existing armored vehicles, developing new weapons, and supporting massive ground operations across multiple theaters. It demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability of British war industry and the priority placed on providing troops with adequate weapons to face German armor. In the broader context of Allied armored operations, the Achilles filled a crucial capability gap. American tank destroyers were numerous and mechanically reliable, but often undergunned against German heavy armor. British tanks, even Fireflies with 17-pounders, were relatively scarce compared to the masses of Shermans equipped with less powerful guns. The Achilles provided Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments with a mobile, reliable platform mounting the best Allied anti-tank gun. This combination of mobility, firepower, and availability made the Achilles a valuable asset that complemented other Allied armored forces. The legacy of the Achilles extends beyond its specific combat record. It demonstrated the value of international cooperation and adaptation in weapons development. The vehicle combined the best elements of American automotive engineering and British ordnance design into a weapon system more effective than either nation could have produced alone in the same time frame. This lesson in combined capabilities and the value of adapting existing equipment to meet new threats remained relevant in post-war military planning. Modern military forces continue to upgrade and modify existing platforms, rather than always developing entirely new systems, an approach that the Achilles program pioneered on a large scale. For the men who crewed Achilles tank destroyers, the vehicle was more than just a weapon system or a historical footnote. It was their workplace, their protection, and their means of completing their mission and, hopefully, surviving the war. The open-top turret that made them vulnerable also gave them superior visibility. The powerful gun that made them priority targets also gave them the ability to fight back effectively. The cramped, noisy, uncomfortable interior was home for days or weeks at a time. These contradictions and compromises were the reality of armored warfare, where perfect solutions didn't exist, and every advantage came with corresponding disadvantages. The broader strategic impact of the Achilles and other 17-pounder platforms helped shift the balance in armored warfare during the last year of the war in Europe. German armor, which had enjoyed qualitative superiority in the middle period of the war, now faced Allied weapons that could defeat even their heaviest tanks. This leveling of capability, combined with Allied numerical superiority and air dominance, meant German armored forces could no longer rely on their tanks' individual superiority to offset Allied advantages in other areas. The 17-pounder, whether mounted in a Firefly, an Achilles, or a towed gun, represented a technological counter to German armor that arrived at a crucial moment in the war. In conclusion, the story of the M10 Achilles and its secret 17-pounder upgrade represents a fascinating chapter in World War II armored warfare. It demonstrates how technical innovation, tactical adaptation, and operational necessity combined to create an effective weapon system. The German tank crews who encountered Achilles tank destroyers without realizing they faced a 17-pounder gun learned a hard lesson about the importance of intelligence and the dangers of assumptions in combat. The British and Commonwealth crews who operated these vehicles, often disguising their capabilities to gain tactical advantage, showed sophistication in understanding both the technical and psychological dimensions of armored combat. The Achilles may not have the fame of the Sherman Firefly or the distinctive reputation of the M18 Hellcat, but its contribution to Allied victory was significant, and its story deserves to be remembered as part of the larger narrative of how the Allies overcame German armored superiority to win the war in Europe.